footage you just saw is real. A woman in a corset stands in a painted garden. She reaches behind an oversized cabbage and pulls out a living baby. She sets it on the ground like produce. Then she does it again. The film is from 1900, the oldest surviving narrative film in existence. The woman playing the fairy is Yvonne Mugnier-Sarand. The director is Alice Guy-Blaché. And almost nobody talks about why this particular story became the first one cinema ever told. February 1896. Paris. A 22-year-old secretary named Alice Guy walks down Boulevard Poissonnière, heading toward the cabarets of Montmartre. But she stops at a storefront she has never noticed before. The windows are brightly lit. Inside, against the wall, are rows of glass and metal boxes. And inside those boxes are living human babies. Premature infants, some small enough to fit in a man's palm, lie inside machines modeled after chicken egg incubators because that is exactly what they are. The inventor, a French engineer named Alexander Lion, patented the device on October 28, 1889. He based it directly on poultry equipment. To fund the operation, he charged the public admission to come watch newborns fight for their lives. 50,000 visitors paid to see these babies in the first year alone. Alice Guy was one of them. Her granddaughter, Regine Blashbolton, confirmed this decades later. Alice walked into that storefront, saw infants displayed in glass boxes for paying strangers, and 3 months later created the first narrative film ever recorded. A fairy harvesting babies from a cabbage garden. The Art Nouveau poster advertising Lion's exhibition makes the connection even more explicit. Designed by Adolfo Hohenstein, it shows a nurse cradling 3 infants. Behind her, vines sprout baby heads in place of flowers. Drawings of children growing like botanical specimens fill the background. This poster hung on the streets of Paris in 1896. Babies depicted as things that grow on plants. Not born, grown. That visual language appeared on a Paris boulevard before the postcards, before the dolls, before any of it. Now this is where most people who cover the topic begin. The postcards. Between 1900 and 1920, hundreds of thousands of postcards flooded Europe and North America showing babies growing in cabbage patches. Babies pulled from the earth like vegetables. Babies tended by gardeners and delivered to couples who browsed through them like shoppers selecting fruit. These images were not produced by a single company running a coordinated campaign. They came from dozens of studios across Germany, France, Russia, Spain, Britain, and the United States. Multiple languages. Multiple artistic styles. No documented coordinating source. Art historians usually classify them as whimsical birth announcements, sentimental imagery, harmless folklore. And they are partially right. In France, children had been told for centuries that boys come from cabbage patches and girls from rose bushes. French parents still call their babies mon petit chou, my little cabbage. In Scotland, children placed cabbage leaves outside to ask fairies for siblings. In Ireland, you were told you were found under a stalk of cabbage. The folklore is old, and it is widespread. So let's address the obvious possibility. Maybe the postcards are exactly what art historians say they are. Birth announcements inspired by old folk traditions. Charming, innocent, unconnected to anything darker. If that were the entire picture, the explanation would be simple enough. But the timeline refuses to stay innocent. Because during the exact decades these postcards circulated, between 1900 and 1920, the largest mass displacement of children in American history was already underway. And the scale of it is difficult to process. September 20th, 1854. A train pulls out of New York City carrying 46 children. They range from infants to 12 years old. No parents travel with them. No family waits at the destination. When the train arrives in Dowagiac, Michigan, the children are lined up on a railroad platform. Local families walk past, inspect them, and choose which ones they want to take home. This is the first orphan train. The last train departs on May 31st, 1929, carrying 3 children to Sulphur Springs, Texas. By that point, somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 children will have been transported this way. At peak volume, 3,000 to 4,000 children per year were shipped west. The first agent overseeing the program, E.P. Smith, allowed passengers to adopt boys without checking references. He appealed directly to the crowd's sympathies, pointing out that boys were handy, while girls could be used for all types of housework. Many of these children were used strictly as farm labor. Many were not orphans at all. They were the children of immigrants and poor families, something the co-founders of the program later acknowledged. The children traveled for days in uncomfortable conditions, sometimes on trains barely better than cattle cars. 2 or 3 adult chaperones supervised 30 to 40 children at a time. When they arrived, they had no birth certificates, no verified family histories, and no provable identity. An estimated 2 million descendants are alive today, many of whom still cannot trace their lineage past the moment their ancestors stepped off a train platform. Where did they come from? The Cabbage Patch. Not literally, of course, but functionally. The mythology performed the same cultural task as a shrug. And the orphan trains were only the American chapter. Across the Atlantic, the system was older and larger. The foundling wheel, called the ruota in Italy, was a rotating wooden cylinder built into the wall of a hospital or church. A woman could place her infant inside, ring a bell, and the staff on the other side would rotate the wheel to receive the child. Anonymous. No questions. No record of the parent. The first one was installed in Rome in 1198. By the 1400s, they had spread across Catholic Europe. By the 1800s, the numbers had become staggering. Across the continent, more than 100,000 foundlings were abandoned every year. In France, Italy, and Spain, as many as 1 in 3 babies born in cities were deposited into these institutions. France alone had 251 foundling wheels at their peak, legalized on January 19, 1811. The death rate inside these foundling hospitals averaged 80%. In some years, it approached 100%. Children who survived were renamed. In Italy, they were called Esposito, meaning exposed. In Milan, they were given the name Colombo, after the pigeons outside the foundling home. In France, they were called trouvé, found. Parents sometimes left a token behind. A ribbon, a coin, a piece of torn fabric, hoping they might someday return and reclaim the child. Most never did. Now hold the timeline in your mind. 1198. The first foundling wheel is installed in Rome. By the 1700s, boys from cabbages, girls from roses, has become the standard explanation given to children across France. 1811. France legalizes 251 foundling wheels. 1854. The first orphan train leaves New York. 1863. France begins closing its foundling wheels. 1869. Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon places a cradle on a Manhattan stoop to receive abandoned babies, founding the New York Foundling Hospital. 1889. Alexander Lyon patents his baby incubator, modeled directly on chicken egg equipment. February 1896. Alice Guy visits Lyon's incubator exhibition on Boulevard Poissonniere and sees babies in glass boxes displayed for paying strangers. Spring 1896. She films La Fée aux Choux. The first narrative film in history is about harvesting babies from a garden. That same year, incubator babies are exhibited at the Berlin Exposition under the name Kinderbrutantstalt. The word translates directly to child hatchery. Between 1900 and 1920, cabbage baby postcards flood the Western world. In 1903, Martin County opens his permanent incubator exhibit at Coney Island, displaying premature infants next to sword swallowers and sideshow acts. Admission costs 25 cents. He runs the attraction for 40 years. Each piece connects to the next. Each decade adds another layer. And every layer repeats the same language. Children as things that are grown, harvested, displayed, selected, and distributed. Not born to families, delivered to them. By fairies. By gardeners. By institutions. I need to be honest about something. I sat with this research for almost a week before I started writing. Not because the facts were difficult to find. They are well documented. The orphan trains have a PBS documentary. The foundling wheels appear in medical journals. Alice Guy-Blaché's visit to the incubator exhibition was confirmed by her own granddaughter. The problem was not evidence. The problem was that every time I laid the timeline out, I could hear how it would sound. I could hear reasonable people saying that I was forcing a pattern onto unrelated events. And I kept asking myself whether that might be true, whether folklore is simply folklore, whether postcards are just postcards, whether the fact that all of this clusters in the same decades across the same countries is simply what coincidence looks like when viewed at scale. Then I found what Salvador Dali said about the postcards. Dali collected them. So did André Breton. So did Paul Éluard, who once described them as a Lilliputian hallucination of the world. Dali called them the most lively document of popular modern thought, a thought so profound or so sharp that it eludes psychoanalysis. The surrealists did not collect them as whimsy. They collected them because they recognized something in the imagery that resisted easy explanation. A British art dealer named James Birch began collecting them in Aix-en-Provence. Years later, he discovered a display case of them at the Pompidou Center, exhibited for their inspirational importance to the Dadaists and Surrealists. In 2010, he published a book titled Babylon, Surreal Babies. Even the art world seemed to understand that these postcards carried something heavier than charm. And the postcards themselves were not gentle. Some of them show babies being sold. Some reference lotteries involving children. Others depict gardeners tending rows of infants while couples browse and point. The imagery is commercial, transactional, and it mirrors the mechanics of the foundling system and the orphan trains with unsettling precision. Babies appear from the earth. They have no parents, no origin story, no history. Someone selects them. Someone takes them home. This is not what a birth announcement looks like. This is what displacement looks like when a culture has agreed to call it something else. The medical establishment of the era makes the picture even darker. Martin County, the man who ran baby incubator exhibits at Coney Island for 4 decades, likely never held a legitimate medical license. He fabricated his credentials because the real medical profession refused to treat premature babies at all. One Chicago doctor even produced a film advocating that they be allowed to die, under the title Kill Defectives, Save the Nation. In 1901, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal openly questioned whether saving premature infants was even worthwhile. The eugenics movement referred to these infants as weaklings who would pollute the gene pool. In that environment, the only way to save a premature baby was to place it in a glass box at an amusement park and charge admission. Martin County saved more than 6,500 lives this way. His nurse, Madame Recht, would slide a diamond ring up a baby's arm to the shoulder to show audiences just how small the infants were. When County died, his death certificate did not mention medicine. Neither did Alexander Lyons. Lyon, the man whose invention inspired the first narrative film ever made, was described on his 1934 death certificate as a wandering salesman. 80 years after the postcards faded from circulation, the story returned. In 1976, a 21-year-old Georgia art student named Xavier Roberts discovered a set of dolls at a craft fair. They had been made by a Kentucky folk artist named Martha Nelson Thomas. Thomas had been creating what she called doll babies since the early 1970s. Each one came with a birth certificate and adoption papers. Roberts purchased her dolls. When Thomas later cut him off, he began producing his own versions. He renamed them Little People. A licensing agent named Roger Schleifer rebranded them again in 1982 as Cabbage Patch Kids and constructed the origin mythology that would define the product. According to the official story, Xavier Roberts was a 10-year-old boy who followed a creature called a bunny bee behind a waterfall and discovered a magical cabbage patch where babies were being born. Roberts sold the dolls from Babyland General Hospital, a converted and abandoned medical clinic in Georgia. He did not sell them. You adopted them. Each doll came with a unique birth certificate and adoption papers. No parents listed. Born in a cabbage patch. Martha Nelson Thomas, the woman who actually created the concept, sued Roberts. The case was settled out of court in 1985 for an undisclosed amount. Her name disappeared from the product. The pattern is difficult not to notice. Coleco mass-produced the dolls in 1983. 3 million sold by the end of that year. 20 million in 1984. $2 billion in retail sales. Americans physically fought each other in stores to adopt them. Dolls with no parents. born from cabbages, distributed through a converted hospital. The entire apparatus of the foundling system compressed into a toy, and almost no one recognized what the story was actually about, because the story had already been telling itself for 800 years. Every culture needs a narrative to explain what it cannot say plainly. You do not tell a child that their sibling was deposited in a wooden box in a church wall by a mother who could not afford to feed them. You tell the child their sibling was found in the cabbage patch. You do not tell a community that 250,000 children were stripped of their identities and shipped across a continent. You send postcards of babies growing in gardens, tended by fairies and delivered to loving homes. The fairy tale performs the work of erasure. It always has. Guy-Blaché saw babies in glass boxes on a Paris boulevard and turned that experience into the first story cinema ever told. That story was about a fairy pulling children from a garden. The original 1896 film is now lost. 90% of all films made before 1929 are gone. We preserved almost nothing from the birth of cinema. The one film that might reveal what the culture was processing when it chose this story as its first has vanished. The postcards remain in museum archives. The orphan train records survive in genealogical databases. The mechanisms of the foundling wheels still sit inside the walls of old hospitals across Europe. The Cabbage Patch Kids rest in attics and storage units across America, each one with its adoption certificate still tucked inside. And somewhere between folklore and documentation, between fairy tale and institutional record, there is a question that almost no one has asked directly. What story does a civilization tell itself when it needs to explain where all the children came from? What mythology does it build when the truth is too large, too systemic, too uncomfortable for a direct answer? And when that mythology appears in the first film, the most popular postcards, and the best-selling toy of the 20th century, each using the same image over and over again. Babies without parents, harvested from a garden. What exactly are we looking at? A coincidence that spans 8 centuries and 6 continents? Or the longest-running cover story in Western history?